Hi, this is Tony Sarles. Today we're going to go over a little bit about Google Maps and JavaScript. So here is basically my finished product as of right now. It loads a map, has a bunch of markers that are identified by value and then color based on that value, and then we have the option to switch between different sensor types. So right now I just put some arbitrary things there. We can change them at a later point, but this is essentially what the front end does. So let's go ahead and look at the code. So we have our main HTML file. I'll assume that most people here have a basic understanding of HTML at least. So of course we start by loading the scripts. I do have jQuery, the Google Map API, obviously mandatory here. It includes the developer key that you have to go to their website and sign up for, and a little ampersand libraries equals visualization, which I can probably take out of there since I did not end up using their visualization library. So the Google Maps visualization library is there for heat maps, which is kind of the desired effect that I was going for, so I tried to implement the heat map libraries here, but essentially they don't work the way we would like them to. The heat map is focused on the number of data points. So you'll see in the heat map shown here that some areas are very red, which basically means that there's a concentration of markers in that area. Now, on our project, we don't care about the concentration of markers so much. We could have 100 sensors within a block of each other, and if the air quality is good, then we still want it to display green, as where the heat map would display red because there's so many concentrated in an area. There is not a way to do the heat map by value without some sort of crazy hack, so I'm not doing that. Instead, we have opted to go with a marker. So I'm sure everybody recognizes a marker here. Basically, we've used the marker class, and then that marker with label.js is basically a third-party library that allows you to append text over the top of the marker so that we could display the data. And then natively, Google Maps API does support the option to change the marker icon. You can use a graphic rather than the default marker. So by changing the graphic and then using the extra library to append text to the top of it, we've created, the interface that that we have here. One thing you might notice in the script tags here is the async defer. Kind of a cool thing I did not realize. So the way JavaScript works, once you load a script, the variables or classes or anything within that script can be accessed by all the other scripts. They're all kind of combined in one container, so to speak. So the only requirement there, though, is that the scripts be loaded in a particular order, because you cannot call a class or a function that has not yet loaded. So the async and defer options basically allow you to load these after the page has already rendered at the end to ensure that the things above it have already loaded. So we don't want to make calls to the Google Map API, for instance, before it's loaded. So we've deferred these to the end. So kind of a cool thing I didn't know previously there. So of course we create a div for the map to go into, and then we have an inline script here just to kind of kick things off. So we have a global variable for the nodes to go into, the latitude and longitude for DePaul, which is where our map is going to center on, and then anybody who's worked with jQuery may recognize this document ready function, which basically waits again for the page to load completely before kicking off. So once the page loads, this script executes, which the essential here, if you were to try to make a map, is assigning this particular class, the Google Maps map class, into your map div. So that is essentially what creates the map right there. It has some options. Most of them are optional, but you can specify, and there's things you can specify beyond what's here, of course. So it's going to center on DePaul with a zoom level of 12. I put in here to create a custom map style, and by custom map style basically refers to, you might have the default of satellite, or you might have a road map. Well, you can put in your own elements and call it your own map style. So here I made some very basic adjustments, not realizing that it was optional, and here's what I ended up with. So it looks a little cleaner, took away some of the detail. Anyways, so as we scroll down towards the bottom here, let's see here, we assign that custom map type into the map. I also ended up defining a right-click behavior just because it's nice for debugging. In this case, I added an event listener to the right-click function, which gets the bounds of the map and then displays into the debugging console the minimum and maximum longitude of the current display. So if I pull it up, if I right-click, I get the minimum and maximum latitude and longitude of the current view. Since I do not know those things offhand, it's nice to be able to pull those things so I can reference them as needed. You'll see if I scroll around and then right-click again, I get those displayed into the console. So the console.log is a nice place to output things for debugging or your own reference. It's also more convenient than popping things up in an alert menu, which is what I had formerly used before realizing the console was a useful thing. Of course, that is a disaster when you accidentally put yourself in an infinite loop and it crashes your browser. So console log, better than alert windows. So the last thing here is at the very end of the script I set a timeout, which basically just puts a manual timer on a function. So here I put 1,000 milliseconds, so a second. So wait for the page to load, and then a second later run this. And I put that purposeful delay in there for AJAX calls to allow everything to load before it starts going and grabbing data. Also helps with ensuring that all the scripts above have already loaded as well. So as for right now, I just have static data, so that's what is not commented out, is loading the static nodes. There's also a control manager class that I created, which we instantize. So you'll notice here when I assign that to a variable, I'm assigning it to window.cm. So when you put a window dot in front of a variable name, essentially you are binding this variable cm to the window, which is the outermost container within JavaScript. So it's basically defining it as a global variable. Since I'm defining this, a couple levels nested, but I want to be able to access it from outside of this function, I'm binding it to the window so that I can reference it in my other script. So let's take a look at this control manager class. So when we do a new control manager, this is what we're pulling. In JavaScript, you don't define classes the way you would in Java, say, where you're actually calling it a class. You're just assigning a function to a variable. JavaScript is very flexible in that you can assign, basically anything to a variable. So we define essentially an anonymous function into the control manager variable, and what's inside of it is more or less the constructor. So I create a new control factory, which is another class I created for pulling each of the controls. These are what the controls are, meaning these little check boxes here. We have a control set, so where all the control nodes or control elements are getting pushed into an array. JavaScript for arrays does natively support a push like a stack, which is nice. So you can dynamically add to an array without having to define array sizes or anything. And essentially what I'm doing is for each, I had defined some sensor types above. For each of those sensors, put them into this array, and then you can also add methods. So, like most object-oriented languages, you have a this. So, I'm saying this set active is my method name. Where again, when there's a function that we're loading in here, and so essentially this set active call is being performed on the window or on this control manager whenever somebody checks a box to switch between the controls. In which case, when somebody does, check a box and set an active node, it goes through each of the controls to uncheck the ones that are no longer active, and then it goes through that nodes array that was the very first line in the other document, where all the nodes are stored, and goes through and runs a refresh on each of those nodes. And that's kind of the basics of how that all ties together. I know it's pretty quick going through all this, but those are some of the basics. Thanks for watching.